So yesterday I finished reading Little Women and then binged 2 of the movie adaptations of it all in one day. After finishing the book, I watched the 1994 Gillian Armstrong directed version of Little Women, which had Susan Sarandon as the mom and Winona Ryder playing Jo, with Christian Bale as Teddy/Laurie. Then I watched the 2019 movie adaptation directed by Greta Gerwig, which, if you've had your head buried under a rock lately, she's also the director of Barbie. And in her version, Saoirse Ronan plays Jo, Laura Dern plays Marmee. We also have Emma Watson as Meg and Timothée Chalamet as Teddy. Really a star-studded cast, I think, in both of these movies. But like I said, I had never read Little Women before, and I had never seen any of the movie adaptations either. And so I was diving into this with a completely clean slate. I had no assumptions about Little Women, what it was about. I remember seeing it when I was a kid, and as a kid I was like a tomboy and I didn't like old stuffy things, and that's kind of how I always imagined Little Women. So I was really pleasantly surprised when I finally picked up Little Women this month and had a really good time. Like, it is a historical slice of life coming of age tale about these 4 sisters that grew up during the Civil War era and just their lives, honestly. So I don't want to go into too much detail about what the story is actually about, because I feel like if you're watching this video, you probably are a fan of Little Women already and have thoughts and feelings as well. And so I'm not really going to give a synopsis, and I am going to talk about spoilers. So if you don't want any spoilers for Little Women, please click off of this video. The whole thing is going to be spoiler filled, because I really just want to talk about things that I liked and didn't like about every version of this story that I saw/read. So the original novel, which came out, I believe, in 1868, the 1994 movie adaptation, and the 2019 movie adaptation. As I dive into all of my thoughts and feelings about each of the versions of this story, please let me know down in the comments below if you've read the book, if you've seen any of these movies, what your thoughts were about them, what your thoughts are on my takes about them, what your favorite version is, all of that kind of jazz. I would love to hear and have a discussion with you about it in the comments below. Let's dive in. So we can't really talk about Little Women without talking about Louisa May Alcott, because this is a super autobiographical story that she wrote, and turns out she's kind of a badass, so that's awesome. I feel like she has like risen in my esteem, which of a person I knew absolutely nothing about to a person I now hold in the same realm as like Susan B. Anthony and Margaret Sanger as far as like historical badass white women. So I'm gonna read through, I made this whole listicle, as you can see, of like things that actually happened in Louisa May Alcott's life, and then we're going to talk about how her story very much mirrors Jo March's story, who is the main character of Little Women. For things that are the same as Jo March, I have a little green check mark, and for things that are not the same as Jo March, I have a little red X. So Louisa May Alcott was raised by transcendentalist parents. If you're not familiar with transcendentalism, that's like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Walt Whitman and all of the things that they did, their kind of whole philosophy about life and living, all of the great poetry that they wrote, that was all in the transcendentalism movement. And her parents were actually personal friends of these people. And so she was like bumping elbows at a very young age with all of kind of the great minds in New England at the time, which is very cool. Her father was a failed teacher and her mother was a social worker, which is exactly like Jo March. Her family did suffer from financial struggles, and she helped support them from a young age through both writing and domestic work. Louisa May Alcott's whole family were abolitionists, and they served as a Underground Railroad station and harbored a fugitive runaway slave for a week back in 1847, which is just incredible. You know, you love to hear about historical people who actually had a good head on their shoulders, which is so rare. Louisa May Alcott was the second born of 4 daughters, just like Jo March. She very much considered herself a tomboy and was into boyish things. She's actually quoted as saying something along the lines of, "I was a man born in a woman's body," or something along those lines. And it's very interesting because I read Little Women, again, having no concept of what the story was about. And when Jo March was being introduced as a character, and several times throughout the book, I thought she was extremely transcoded. If it was a modern day author writing this exact same story and using those exact same words, I would be like, oh, she's hinting that Jo is trans. And that's not the case, but I think she was just using strong language to indicate how much of a tomboy Jo was. And I think perhaps if being trans was a socially accepted thing back in the day, that maybe Jo would have been, which is an interesting kind of thought experiment. But Jo in the book regularly calls herself the man of the house and does manly tasks and likes men's work, and her other sisters sometimes jokingly call her their brother. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. Louisa May Alcott remained unmarried for her entire life, and Jo March does not. She is married by the end of the book, but we'll talk about that more later because I think there was some interesting commentary about that. Hey, it's next day editing Sandra popping in because I forgot to ever come back on this point, which was that in the 2019 movie, they actually do make a nod to Louisa May Alcott's spinsterhood, wherein Jo is negotiating with her novel editor, and he says something along the lines of, if you have a woman as a protagonist in your story, she needs to be married by the end of it. And Jo sort of half-heartedly pushes back against this, but then basically concedes and is like, okay, yeah, I'll make sure she's married by the end of the book. This sort of raises the question of, like, did Louisa May Alcott actually make Jo be married in Little Women because of advice that people around her were giving her? You know, basically, did she make the decision to have Jo be married because she knew it would sell more books and not because that's necessarily how she preferred the book to end? So I just thought that was an interesting thought. Because they were so poor, only her youngest sister was actually able to attend public school, and that also mirrors Amy being the only one going to public school in Little Women. One of her younger sisters died of scarlet fever, again mirroring Beth's story in Little Women. Louisa May Alcott was a suffragist and was the very first woman to register to vote in the city of Concord, Massachusetts. So that's awesome. She was super supportive, apparently, of women's rights. Her older sister did marry a man named John, which she attributed to breaking up her family, which is something that Jo March definitely feels when Meg gets married to John in the book. And Louisa May Alcott actually served as a nurse for the Union in the Civil War. And during her short stint as a nurse, she became deathly ill with typhoid fever and had to cut her nursing days in the war short. So that it doesn't happen in Little Women, but that does happen to basically her father. Her father, I believe, is a chaplain for the Union Army in the Civil War, and that's why he's away for the entire first half of the book. And then he doesn't get typhoid fever. I think he just gets like pneumonia, but he becomes deathly ill and has to come home early. So as you can see, this Little Woman is extremely autobiographical of an actual woman's life during this time in history, which is just so fascinating because it really goes to show kind of the thoughts of women in the day. Now, one of the things that I think is a big obvious thing once you see all of this laid out right here is that the transcendentalism of her family, the abolitionism of her family, and is abolitionism a word? It sounds funny. Okay. And the suffragist movement that she was a part of, the women's rights movement, is basically excluded from Little Women. And it does talk about how Louisa May Alcott published kind of sensationalist stories in newspapers, just like Jo March does, in order to earn money for her family, and that Little Women was basically her first like big breakout success book, which Jo March is not attributed to writing the book, but there is a big emphasis on how she wrote stories to make money to support her family. And so I do wonder if Louisa May Alcott made these decisions, even though the story was very autobiographical, if she made the decisions to leave out transcendentalism being an abolitionist, being a suffragist from the narrative in order to sell more books, because those ideas obviously were very radical for the time. And I do wonder if she was either intentionally making that decision for herself, or if she was advised potentially by an editor or a friend to like, let's not talk about those things and your book will probably sell a lot more copies. So anyway, I just thought that was very interesting. But yeah, Louisa May Alcott, total badass, and very happy now to have read her most famous book. So when I was reading Little Women, I didn't really have too many issues with the narrative, other than Jo March talks about many times how she never wants to get married. She's not interested in love. She really just wants like affection and companionship. And so the fact that Jo does end up married and doesn't marry Teddy is like my biggest issue with the book. So it's not really an issue so much, but just like I loved Jo and Teddy's relationship when I was reading the book. They were childhood friends, obviously. If it's been a while since you've read it or seen the movie, they kind of grew up together. Teddy was kind of the next door neighbor / brother figure for all of the girls, but him and Jo especially had this like really special relationship. And she initially, like, the reason that she kind of rejects him when he finally proposes to her is because she's like, we're too similar, we'll quarrel all the time, and you know, we're just not right for each other. But like, I think their friendship kind of proves that they were, at least more so. I felt so much more chemistry reading Jo and Laurie / Teddy than I did when Jo met Frederick, the German professor that she eventually ends up marrying in the book. And so I was just like really disappointed about that, because I love Jo and Laurie's friendship so much, and I just wanted them to be together and be happy. And so after that didn't happen, I was just like, ugh, now I want to read some like fan fiction where Jo and Teddy end up together in the end. I don't have a problem with Teddy and Amy's or Laurie and Amy's relationship, but I just never felt the chemistry between Jo and Frederick that I did with Jo and Laurie. And so yeah, I was just like ultimately disappointed by that. For the rest of, while we're talking about the book, I just kind of want to talk about some things that came to my attention more so when I was watching the movie adaptations, of some things that I wish were different. I didn't necessarily notice them while I was reading the book because I was just kind of immersed and not thinking about it. I was just like enjoying the story for what it was. But after seeing some of the changes that the movies make, I have stronger opinions about how differently I wish the book had been. And so let's just talk about some of those real quick. Let's talk about Amy, first of all. Amy is Jo's youngest sister, and there is a time jump in the book. The first half of the book maybe is like a year of their lives during the Civil War when their father is away. And then it jumps forward like 3 years. And then the second half of the book, starting from 3 years in the future, and then it extends many more years. I'm not sure how many years technically the second book covers, but it's quite a few. So when the book starts out, Amy, I think, is like 12. She's the youngest sister. And at the time, Jo is like 15 or 16. And I hated Amy in the first half of the book. She was just like an annoying little kid. She's super whiny. She seems very shallow. And I didn't get on with her at all. And so I just wanted to talk about like what a great character arc Amy has, because by the end of the book, she was like my second favorite character besides Jo and Laurie. She just like really goes through some big growth, I think, as she grows up, which you would expect, but I just feel like it was portrayed so well because she becomes very sophisticated and graceful. And in a lot of ways, she's like all the things that Jo isn't. All of the kind of character flaws that Jo has, Amy reflects in a more positive way. And I think that was just portrayed really well. So I loved Amy by the end of the book, even though I was like really annoyed by her in the beginning. One of the things that I didn't like, and this was something that I did notice as I was reading it, was that Meg's was the oldest sister, and she has a very integral part of the story in terms of her relationships with her sisters. But after she marries John, her narrative just kind of drops off, and all of the rest of the story that involves Meg is about either her relationship with John or her relationship with her children, or her relationship with her mom. But it never really goes back to the sisterly relationships that it focused on so heavily in the first half of the book. And so I was just disappointed that Meg wasn't given that same sort of care and diligence in terms of her sisterly relationships when she goes off and marries John. I also just didn't like it while I was reading the book. I didn't like the age gap between Jo and Professor Frederick Bear. I think they're like 15 years apart, but he's basically in his 40s and she is in her mid-20s. And I didn't feel quite right about that. I felt okay about it in the book. Professor Bear is obviously very respectful of Jo when they are together in New York, which is where she meets him. They live in the same boarding house for a while. And he never like tries to make a move on her or anything like that. He thinks that she has a sweetheart back home. So their relationship really doesn't happen until he like goes to visit her when she's back with her family. He meets her whole family, gets approval from the family, that sort of thing. And so it's made out to be okay in the book, but I didn't feel like super great about it, even though I know like, yeah, they're all adults at that time, but I know that real age gap romances happen like that all the time and they're fine and everything was above grade, but it's just personally like an ick for me that I didn't like. I also didn't like how when Jo is in New York with Professor Bear, he tells her he doesn't like her sensationalist stories and that she can do better and write better, which is true and something that Jo needed to hear. And, you know, it's kind of like a pivotal moment in her character arc. But the thing I didn't like about how it was written in the book is that Jo just kind of like accepts what he says. And Jo throughout the book has like a really hot temper and she's very willing to stand up for herself, and she just kind of doesn't in that scene. And I felt like that was a failing of the writing because Jo was acting a little bit out of character there. And this is actually one of the things that I thought both of the movie versions did better, because both the 1994 movie and the 2019 movie had Jo react to that in a very negative way. And I think that was more true to Jo's character. Also, the end of the book has Jo opening a boarding school for boys, like especially poor and orphaned boys. And that was kind of out of the blue in the book. There was nothing where Jo was like talking about how she wanted to open a school. It was just very sudden, and all of her family is also like taken by surprise that Jo wants to open a school. And I just feel like that could have been like seeded a little bit better throughout the book of like, oh, I'd like to open a school or whatever, because really the whole time she's just like, I want to write and I want to support my family through writing. And then all of a sudden, like, she's gifted a house and she's just like, I'm going to open a school and that's what I'm going to do with my life. And also the fact that it's like exclusively a boys' school, I just don't like. I know it's because like Jo's like always only like gotten along with men and like has considered herself a man and stuff like that, but I liked the way that it was done in some of the movies better. So we'll talk about that once we talk about the movies. And then my biggest kind of disappointment with the book, having now seen other versions of it especially, is that Jo puts her writing dreams on the back burner when she opens this school at the end of the book. And by the end of the book, she's never published a novel that she's like really happy with. She's written these sensationalist stories. She did have a book published, but she got like kind of hot and cold reviews for it, and so she was never like super confident about it. And then she opens a school and she writes some poems and things, and like her writing is improving, but then she is just basically decided, oh, someday I still hope I'll write like a great American novel, but that's just not as big of a priority for me. And I felt like that was like what we were building towards the whole book, was that like Jo's going to be this great writer, and then at the end she opens a school instead. And I just wish, like, if I was to rewrite Little Women, that would end differently for me. So that's pretty much everything I wanted to say about the book specifically. So now let's talk about the movie adaptations of it and what I think they did well and what they didn't do well. Starting with the Gillian Anderson 1994 movie. So as I said, I never saw any Little Women adaptations when I was growing up, and I know that this movie came out at a time, especially for a lot of people who are watching this clip right now, may have like grown up watching this movie, and so it has a lot of nostalgia. It's a classic, that sort of thing. So just please take everything I say with a grain of salt and know that I don't have any nostalgic feelings for it, and if you love it, that's okay. But I did not love it. I thought that honestly it was a pretty faithful adaptation of like the beats of the story, but I didn't think that it necessarily did anything better than either the later movie version or the book itself. And a few things were worse. So let's talk about it. My biggest problem with the 1994 Little Women adaptation is just that there is like very little relationship development. Everything just kind of happens as if you already have so much feeling for these characters. You already have read the book and are super invested and you know exactly what's happening. There's not enough screen time given to individual relationships between the sisters, between Jo and Teddy, between Teddy and Amy. Also, like Mr. Lawrence and John Brooks are barely even characters in this movie, and they're obviously huge characters in the book. Susan Sarandon was cast to play Marmee, and though I did like some aspects of her, like the corset line, if you're familiar with the movie, I thought was great. That was a great moment between her and Meg. But I just feel like her portrayal of Marmee was a little bit too stern and not really warm enough to be the Marmee that we knew and loved from the book. So my biggest problems with this version were just there was very little screen time given to the relationships themselves. There was plenty of plot beats, but I didn't have any strong feelings about anything that happened in the film. I did like that they used age-appropriate actors for all of the roles in the film, and I thought Kirsten Dunst as a young Amy was delightful. She was so good at it, and she was then later aged up when the movie does a time jump later and is a different actress, which I think was the right call for a movie adaptation, because she starts as a 12-year-old and by the end she's probably like 22 or 23, and so having different actors play that I think is the right choice. Another thing I did not like about this version that I thought was worse than the way the book did it was Jo and Professor Frederick actually do have a relationship while she's still in New York, while they're living in the same boarding house together. They played it faithfully to the book in that Professor Bear is a man in his 40s while Jo is a young woman in her early 20s, and I felt like it felt even more weird seeing it on screen because Jo seems a bit like a naive young woman, and not that she's being taken advantage of necessarily, but in the book he doesn't take that step because he thinks that she is in a relationship with her sweetheart Lori back home, and he just doesn't really know her family situation, and so he waits and gets approval from the family before he ever makes a move on Jo, so to speak. So the fact that they like dated in New York, while I did think that did give them a lot of on-screen relationship development, which was something that a lot of the other relationships in the movie were lacking, I did not like the relationship, so I just didn't like it. There were allusions in this movie to things that happened in the book that were not included on screen. For instance, I think after Beth dies, there's a moment where their house servant Hannah is like tucking in her dolls, and it does show that one of the dolls is like armless, but it never talked about why the doll was armless. It never showed Beth on screen playing with her dolls, which was like a big thing in the book. Those were more almost like Easter eggs for fans of the book, but never gave enough screen time to actually develop the characters on screen. The one thing I did like about this movie version in particular, like I mentioned earlier that the book did not do, is they added in a bit more of Louisa May Alcott's life in there, where Meg, when she's getting ready for a party with her friends kind of make fun of Meg because her parents are against slavery. And then Jo, when she's in New York, does talk about how her parents were transcendentalists when she's talking to Friedrich. So I did like those aspects included because that was just something that I wish the book had done. And then at the end, when Jo is given Aunt March's house after she dies, the idea for opening the school isn't even Jo's idea. Marmee is the one to bring up the idea and be like, this would be a great school. And that I feel like just took character agency away from Jo. It didn't even make that much sense to me that she wanted to open a school, and then the fact that it wasn't even her idea in the movie version, just like, no, didn't like that. So that's pretty much all I have to say about the 1994 movie. Like I said, I do think it hit the big highlighted important plot beats and everything, and it told the story fairly faithfully, but I just didn't think it was good. The most important part of Little Women is the relationships between the sisters and their other family members and their neighbors. And I just don't think any of those relationships really shined. So let's talk about Greta Gerwig's 2019 version. I do think that this one is better than the 1994 version. I don't think either of them are better than the book. So let's just get that out of the way first. The book is better. But I do think that this 2019 Greta Gerwig Little Women adaptation brought a lot to the table that the 1994 version was missing. Primarily, again, because I just harped on this, it's the character relationships. All of the character relationships between the individual sisters, between Marmee and her daughters, between Jo and Lori, between Lori and Amy, between even Beth and Mr. Lawrence and Meg and John Brooks. Again, all of these relationships were given lots of on-screen time, so you actually got a feel and cared for the characters, I think, the way you were supposed to. However, my biggest issue with this version is that it skips all over the timeline, back and forth, back and forth. It starts off with Jo already being in New York and Amy already being in France, and then it jumps backwards 7 years, and then all of the rest of the time jumps that happen throughout the movie are just not even like given the 7 years earlier or 7 years later or whatever they're doing. It just happens. And so you just have to like put the pieces together that, oh, we jumped time again, and this did not add anything to the story or the way the narrative was told. I think sometimes slowly revealing things or like jumping around in a timeline can like make things more exciting or like pull the plot line along in like interesting and unique ways, but this didn't. It just made it confusing and it added absolutely nothing. And I just thought that was probably extra confusing if you weren't familiar with the story. Even for me, as someone who had like literally just finished the book and literally just finished the 1994 movie, like minutes before I dove into this one, I don't think that this movie did a very good job of bringing new fans into the story who weren't familiar already with the book, because I think the timeline jumping was confusing. Let's talk about Amy, because this was another big like red X on this film for me, is that Amy was cast as the same actress, Florence Pugh, when she is both 12 and in her young 20s. The actress herself, I believe, is in her 20s, and so her playing a 12-year-old was very weird. I do think they should have chosen two different actresses to play young Amy and aged up Amy. It's a lot more acceptable, I think, to be like, oh, she's 15 and now she's 26 or whatever, and kind of choose an actress that's in the middle of those ages, or like do the makeup trick where they seem a lot younger or older than they are when it's a span of 10 years. But 12 to 22 is like such a significant age difference that it's really hard to try and pretend you're 12 years old when you're actually 25 or however. I don't know how old Florence Pugh really is. But all I'm saying is it wasn't the right choice. Florence did a good job. I think she is a talented actress, and I did like her portrayal of Amy. I think even her playing like a petulant 12-year-old, she acted her ass off, okay? Like, she played a petulant 12-year-old, but that doesn't mean it was enjoyable to watch. Like, just because she did it well doesn't mean it was believable. There's just something there that doesn't work. And I think especially the time jumps added to the confusion of Amy's character in particular, because you just had to put together from context clues, especially if you're not familiar with the story, whether Amy is acting or whether Florence Pugh was acting as a 12-year-old or as a woman in her young 20s. One thing that I do give huge kudos to Greta Gerwig for in this version is that they aged down Frederick, Professor Bear, who Jo ends up marrying in the end. And so their relationship does not seem creepy to me in this movie because they are within the realm of the same age category. And so I did very much approve of that change in this film. However, this was one of the few relationships in this movie that I did not feel like was given the proper amount of screen time for me to really like feel the feelings that I wanted to feel about their relationship. I also found that, at least in comparison to the 1994 film, this 2019 film included basically all of the plot points from the 1994 film, but way more plot points were also included from the book that did not make it into the 1994 film. And so in that way, I think this one not necessarily was more true to the story, but included so much more of the story, including things like Meg and John's marriage struggles after they get married because of their financial troubles, and how Teddy takes the girls and his college friends on a picnic, and when Beth gets into an argument with her sisters while her mom is away taking care of their dad about how they need to go and help the poor needy family, and she's the only one that's been doing it, and that's like the whole reason she gets scarlet fever to begin with. In the first film, she just goes, but she doesn't really have that argument that makes you realize, like, oh, like, if Joe had gone, or if one of the other sisters had gone, they would have been the one with scarlet fever. Whereas in the 1994 film, it's just like, oh, Beth got scarlet fever. So I thought that was like an important distinction that actually got screen time. It shows Joe taking Beth to the sea so that she can recover and start to feel better. So that was a good character development moment from the book that made it into this film. It also showed Marmee actually being a social worker and helping the needy, which was an important part of her character, as well as the kind of end scene of the movie, which was also the end scene of the book, which was several years after Joe has opened her school and the family's all together. They're all happy and thriving, and it's Marmee's birthday, and they're like celebrating that. So the fact that that kind of actually mirrored the book really well, I thought was well done. Then we have definitely one thing I did not like as much about the Greta Gerwig version was Joe kind of sort of changes her mind about rejecting Teddy's proposal, and I did not like that, because I think that Joe and Teddy either should have been together, or Joe should have ended up single for the rest of her life and been a spinster like actual Louisa May Alcott. So the fact that she like changes her mind kind of, and she actually writes a letter to Teddy where she's like, if you ask me again, I might say yes. And she leaves it in their little postal box between their two houses for him to find when he comes back from Europe. And then when he does come back from Europe and she finds out he's married to Amy now, she like goes and like rips up the letter and throws it in the lake or whatever. I just don't think that was true to Joe's character. Joe was very adamantly not into Teddy in a romantic way, and she never had any regrets about that. I think she was lonely and she did want companionship, and I think that part of it was true. But the fact that she was like kind of having second thoughts about turning him down, I don't think was very true to her character. So I didn't really appreciate that change that they made. And then dominoing from that, then when Teddy and Amy do come back from Europe and they're married, in the book, Joe is just like unequivocally happy for them. She is like so excited. Teddy's finally her brother like he was always meant to be, and she thinks Amy made the right choice, and she thinks they're a great couple. But because of the way that this played out with her writing the letter saying like, oh, ask me again and I might say yes. Then when Teddy comes back and tells her that he has married Amy, then she has this like, oh, you know, and it's like, it's just an awkward reunion between them, rather than her being like unequivocally happy for him, which is what the true friend sister should have felt and what Joe felt in the book. There was also just this like director choice that was made where a couple times throughout the movie, someone wrote a letter, and rather than just like doing a voiceover narrative where you like see them writing the letter and then you're hearing via movie effects what the letter actually says, in this movie the actors would actually just like stare at the camera and say what the letter said, and like I just felt like that was kind of awkward and weird, and I just didn't like that. That was just like a personal thing, but I would have rather just had a voiceover than for them to like kind of break the fourth wall and stare into the camera and say what the letter said. But there were a lot more things about this movie that I did think were pretty cool and done well. There's the scene at the end where Joe runs after Frederick to catch him before he gets on the train, and her sisters are like hyping her up and they're like, yeah, you go girl, go get him. And I just thought that was really cute and like very true to how women are more. And so I thought that was like a cute sisterly moment that happened, even though that's not what happened in the book. I did like the way that they did it in this movie. I also thought that Joe's motivation for opening the school actually made sense in this version, and that's the only one I can say that about, because Joe is talking about how, you know, her and her sisters never had a chance at a good education. You know, Amy's the only one that went to public school, and she had a really shitty teacher, and you know, it was like a really terrible experience. And so the fact that she not only wants to open a school, but wants to make it open to girls and boys so that her nieces and nephews can have a good school experience and a good school to go to, I think made way more sense. And I appreciated that a lot more than her just like randomly out of the blue saying she wanted to open a school, or Marmee in the 1994 film just being like, this would make a good school, you should do it. Yeah, I didn't like that. But yes, in this movie, done well. Another thing that I thought this movie did better than either the book or the previous movie was we actually see Teddy being an irresponsible young man in Europe, which in the book, that was more we were told rather than shown, because Teddy just shows up and Amy's like, oh, you've been bad, haven't you? You've like been flirting with lots of girls and drinking too much or whatever. But we don't actually see him do that. And then in this newest movie, we actually see Teddy like strolling into a party an hour late with like multiple girls on his arms, and he's like so drunk he can barely stand up. And so I did think that us actually seeing Teddy being like this young man in over his head, like dealing with heartbreak and rejection in a negative way, was a good character moment for him, even though he was being bad. And then the other thing that I thought that I really liked about this version in particular, better than the book or the previous movie, was that Joe publishes Little Women, which again is Louisa May Alcott and not Jo March. But the fact that she takes all this advice and all of these thoughts and feelings about how her life has gone and puts it down on paper and actually publishes a book that she is proud of, not just these sensationalist newspaper stories that she's writing for money, but like her family's saga. And she like butts heads with the editor and she has to fight for what she wants. And it actually shows her like negotiating for higher pay and things like that. None of that is in the book, but I did like the inclusion of it. I thought it gave us a stronger, more satisfying ending for Joe as a character and for the narrative as a whole. So I feel like I've been talking a long time. That's pretty much it. Next day editing Sandra, back again. I know, as if this video wasn't long enough already, but if you were reading the list that was beside me, you saw probably two things on there that I forgot to ever actually talk about out loud. One of which was Joe's motivation for going to New York. In the book, Joe actually has a suspicion that Beth, her sister, is in love with Lori, and she wants to make space for that. She also has the suspicion that Lori is in love with her, and she wants to dissuade him from feeling that way. And so she decides to go to New York and get away from all of them to provide space for Teddy's feelings to cool off and for potentially Beth and Teddy's feelings, Lori's feelings, to develop. That's the reason she goes in the book. And then I think each movie changed that. So in the 1994 movie, she actually doesn't go to New York until after she's already rejected Teddy's proposal. Whereas in the book, Teddy doesn't propose to Joe until after she gets back. And so in the first film, she goes to New York because she's just rejected Teddy, and now she wants basically to provide some space for herself to kind of give herself a new start, or to give Teddy some space or those feelings to simmer down. And then in the 2019 movie, they never really give a reason for why she goes to New York. The movie starts with her already in New York, and then they never really talk about why she went there other than just to like do some more writing and accept a governorship for the summer or whatever, which I thought was a little weird. The second thing I wanted to mention, which I forgot to, was just the scene where, and this is pretty congruent across all three versions, that when Joe goes after Frederick and she's like basically telling him to stay, that she wants to be with him, and he's poor, and so he says a line that's like, I have nothing to give you, my hands are empty. And then she actually takes his hand in hers and she says, well, now they're not, or something cute and romantic along those lines. And the 1994 adapted that very faithfully. And then The lines are said in the 2019 movie, but she doesn't actually hold his hand while she says it, and so it just felt weird. Or like if she does, it happened like so quickly, and then she like flings her arms around him and she's hugging him. But so I didn't feel like the line hit the way it was supposed to in the 2019 movie, because she wasn't like holding his hand to say, now your hands aren't empty anymore or whatever. Anyway, just wanted to pop in here and make sure I covered all the points I intended to. Like I said, I absolutely love the book. I highly recommend that you read it if you are a fan of either of the movies and you haven't seen it. Give it a shot. It's so good. It was quite long and slow, but that is the point of it, because you really get to know and fall in love with all of these characters so much. I really felt their joy, I felt their angst, I cried. It takes a lot to make me cry, but I did cry reading Little Women, which was such a surprise for me. It's just wonderful. A few other things to mention. If you are interested, if you love Little Women and you have also consumed all of this Little Women media, and you're obviously like watching YouTube videos about Little Women, I have two other recommendations to make. One of them is a book called So Many Beginnings by Bethany C. Morrow. And this I considered actually reading for inclusion in this video, but ultimately decided against it because it is called a Little Women remix. So it's not a retelling, but it is like taking inspiration from the story and taking it in its own direction. So I didn't really want to like try and compare that to the original story and its attempted adaptation, because it's not so much an adaptation as it is a remix. But basically, So Many Beginnings is about a family with 4 sisters during the Civil War era, but the March family is all Black and they live in a freedmen settlement. So I'm super fascinated to get my hands on that at some point in the future, but like I said, I have not read it in time to include it in this video, but I would recommend that if that sounds interesting to you and you're a fan of the story. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was I found out that there is an Alcott April readathon happening on YouTube with a lot of booktubers that I follow, such as Novel Idea, Kelly Reads a Lot, Beautiful Minutia. So I will tag all of their channels down below. Unfortunately, I didn't find out about Alcott April until after my library hold had already come in for Little Women, so I just went ahead and went for it. But I thought I would use this as an opportunity to shout out the Alcott April readathon. So if you're interested in reading more of Louisa May Alcott's stories or hearing more about them on YouTube, there will be a lot of channels talking about them next month, so please be sure to check out their videos down below. That's everything. Thanks so much for tuning in and hanging out with me for a little bit today. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you again soon for my March wrap up. In the meantime, please be kind, read books, and hit the subscribe button below for more bookish content to come. Bye!